Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. Well, I can say again, Mission Impossible has been assigned. We like to do stuff like that. Richard Kazimer, our friend from the United States, joins us again. How are you, Richard?
I'm doing fine, brother. How are you?
Oh, doing extremely well. Now, my friend, something that's been in the news for quite a while. It is a bit of a concern here, but just from what we've been able to gather, it's been more of a concern in the US in recent times, and that's been car recalls. I mean, Toyota have had a pretty rough time in the United States, and I know there's talk there about potential lawsuits and what have you, but has this in the United States, as it might have done for some people here, brought into sharp focus the question as to whether or not your new car is really as safe as you might think?
Auto recalls, with as many millions of cars that are made here, it's inevitable that you would get a recall. How that translates to auto safety, I would say maybe about 5 years ago, that the automakers were not making cars the way they used to, is to last as long as they did, a little shoddy workmanship here and there. But the economy and the competition, particularly from stellar auto companies up until, a few months ago, Toyota and Honda, that now they're turning things around, that the American automakers had better make a car that's going to last and is going to be safe, or else they are going to be out of business. And it wasn't that many months ago that a few of them were facing total obliteration.
Some people have suggested that they've made a big deal about it politically in the United States because they're trying to help the US car manufacturers. Firstly, do you buy that argument? And secondly, is there any sort of evidence that might back that up to say they're being tougher on Toyota and Honda over car recalls than they would be over GMH, Ford or Chrysler?
I wouldn't say so, because there are Toyota plants here in the United States. So if they go after Toyota as a company, that would put American workers out of a job as well. And Toyota is a great car. It has been the number one selling car in America for many years.
It's interesting you say that, because Toyota is also the top selling motor car here in Australia as well. So clearly they've got a brand. They know how to market it no matter where they are in the world. I think it would be fair to say, and they've certainly been fairly quick, as is the Japanese custom, to come out and apologise and say that we're prepared to do something about this. And maybe that Japanese custom is also the one thing that's really going to help Toyota, because they are prepared to come out and say, hang on a second, this isn't our usual standard, we're sorry about that, this isn't something that we would normally do, we will inspect and fix this problem as soon as possible. You kind of got the impression when Mr. Toyota stood up and said, we're going to do something about this, you were kind of left with the impression that they were going to do something about it. Did you get that same feeling?
Yes, I did, and they have, as a matter of fact. Initially, late last year and early this year, 4.9 million Toyotas were recalled because of the floor mat problem, which was getting stuck under the accelerator pedal. The gas pedal recall was an additional 2 million that followed just a few weeks ago. So that was a totally separate recall, and that recall is still being scrutinized as to what, if at all, there was anything wrong, whether it's a gas pedal problem or is it the carpet problem. So they suffered about 6 million cars recalled in the past 4 months. But they're doing something about it, and it affected sales initially. A lot of the other car dealers were coming out, or the automakers were saying, well, that Toyota's going to recall, not necessarily naming them by name, but saying buy local. But since the recall, Ford has taken over. But Ford has done a lot of retooling, to their credit.
Yeah, mind you, of course, one of the interesting things is a bit like airlines. Airlines never make a big deal about whether they've got a good safety record or not, simply because one incident and that's all blown away. You kind of imagine that if you were trying to have a go at one of your competitors by saying, well, they've just had a safety recall, that's going to be all well and good until you, as you probably will at some time in the future, have your own safety recall, and then all of a sudden that all goes to hell in a handbasket.
There's probably not a day that goes by that some car, some model is not having a recall. You can go online and just type in auto recalls and you'll see a list of things. And they could be as benign as the side mirror doesn't work, or a window doesn't go up or down, or something like that. Something a light doesn't stay on, but not life-threatening. This was one of the first times in quite a long time that Toyota or any of the car manufacturers over here had something as potentially life-threatening as this recall.
And I think they did have a couple of accidents that resulted in fatalities too, didn't they?
There's a difference between the floor mat recall and the accelerator pedal recall. I was looking at the top 10 recalls in U.S. auto history, including Toyota, and the floor mat only comes in at number 5. They're not even listing the gas pedal issue because the jury's still out on what is actually causing it.
Yeah, there was some suggestion at some point in news reports over here it might have had something to do with a computer chip. Have you heard the same thing?
Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple Computers, is a staunch Toyota Prius driver, and he's experienced some of the same acceleration problems. He's equating it to a software problem, and as you know, cars in the past 10 years have been more and more computerized. It could be a hard drive problem that's causing this acceleration problem, particularly with a Prius that is so computer-generated.
Which probably at some point will also mean that we're going to end up having different styles of computer programs that are going to drive our cars.
To that point, there is a Right to Repair Act that's been going on. I've been hearing some commercials being aired here in the Boston area about people who signed a petition for a Right to Repair Act, which actually is a piece of legislation that will allow auto mechanics who don't work for any of the car companies, who don't work for the auto dealers, to have access to the codes that are generated when you plug in the diagnostics computers. Now, the car manufacturers don't want independent mechanics to have that information because they're claiming that it's a violation of their copyrights.
No, the reason why they don't want mechanics to have that is so they can continue to charge overtoed odds for service.
That's exactly right, and that's why the group of mechanics are trying to get this legislation passed through.
Yeah, well, actually, it makes sense. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't. And if somebody's a competent and qualified mechanic, then they should be able to work on your car. And of course, one of the things that many people feel, same issue here, Richard, people know that often they'll pay more at dealers to get their car serviced than they will with a perfectly competent local mechanic. Mind you, that's not to say that some dealers don't offer good prices, because they certainly do. But I think what people like to have is the choice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. We're talking to our friend Richard Kazimer from the United States. Richard finds himself in Massachusetts. That's where he lives these days. Water restrictions. We have quite a few water restrictions here. Do you ever have water restrictions anywhere in the United States? I kind of think of places like Arizona and Nevada and think there'd be massive water restrictions in places like that, and perhaps even New Mexico as well. Do you have lots of water restrictions there?
Absolutely. You could go town by town, how much rainfall, how much snow we've had in the winter. If it's a very hot summer and the aquifers and the water tables go down, any town can impose a water restriction, which is everything from you're running your sprinklers to washing your car. They can monitor how much volume of water you use per household. If you use more than that, you can be fined. It's not unusual, too, for one town to use as much water as you want and the next town over have a water restriction. So, yeah, it's a common thing, and it's all through my life I have seen water restrictions in just about every place that I've lived.
Isn't it funny, you do it on a town-by-town basis? How does that work?
Towns have the ability to do that, depending on where the water comes from. In some rural areas, individual homes can have their own wells, artesian wells. I'm not talking about the old bucket well types, but artesian deep wells that go directly into your home. Now, that water has to be monitored, has to be regulated so that you don't have arsenic in it or any ground leaching or some harsh chemicals or whatever. But most of the towns will have town water, which comes from either a reservoir or a lake in either the local area. It could be 20, 30 miles away. It depends on wherever the water comes from. Those lakes and those reservoirs that supply drinking water, generally you can't fish in it, swim in it, or have a boat, and there's no sewage that goes into it. Each town is required to monitor their water consumption, and it's up to the local mayor or the local officials to say, you know what, we're going to conserve. We don't want to get caught if there's a fire or something like that the water pressure will be down because we're using so much of it. So every town can allocate how much water residents can use.
Has availability and supply of water ever become an issue anywhere in the United States?
On a yearly basis, yes.
On a yearly basis, or even indeed on an ongoing basis?
Absolutely. The way the climate change is, if we're getting less rain, less snow that replenishes the lakes and the streams and the water tables, particularly out west this past year, the water tables have been very low. So, yeah, it is an ongoing problem. Fortunately, though, more and more we're conserving water, and with our waste treatment plants actually recycling the water, not putting that water back into the drinking water, but actually putting it back into the ecosystem, which then evaporates, becomes rain, and so forth. But yes, it is an ongoing problem.
Is it liable to be less of a problem this year because you had a particularly harsh winter this year, didn't you?
When we get a lot of snow in a short period of time, that's different than getting a steady amount of snow throughout the winter. So we've had a fairly mild winter. We've had some big storms. What's happened here in this area is not the same as what may have happened in western Massachusetts or up north going towards New Hampshire or Canada. It all depends on the topography as well. It's different from town to town and different from state to state.
Yeah, see, obviously you don't have reservoirs that supply multiple areas by the sound of things. Is that correct or not so? Because the way you're talking, I sort of imagine that a lot of places have their own water supply, unlike, say, in West Australia where you might have several dams, but they supply dozens of places.
We have so many communities in certain counties. So many towns will make up a county. So that county will get its water from the nearest reservoir, the nearest, water table. And then the next county, which represents a bunch of cities and towns, will get their water elsewhere. But it's not like the state of Massachusetts doesn't get its water from one single supply.
Yeah, well, and how many, let's take, for example, where you are, the state of Massachusetts, how many dams would be there for supplying drinking water, do you think?
The Quabbin Reservoir is one that supplies a good portion of the water to Boston and the greater Boston area. I live in a town called Woburn. This was actually the subject of a movie called A Civil Action with John Travolta and Robert Duvall, where the town's drinking water was contaminated by a company that had polluted it, and people were coming down with leukemia, which is probably why the house was so cheap when I bought it. So they had to do a reclamation, and then during that time when the water table was cleaned up, this town got its water, I believe, from the Quabbin Reservoir. Each town, each area gets its water from the closest resource. That's the great thing about being on a public water system, is that they can divert water to another area.
Beautiful. As always, Richard, thank you very much for your time, and you enjoy yourself, won't you? We'll talk to you. I'm going on holidays for a few weeks, so we'll talk to you when I get back.
All right, brother. You have a great vacation, and go Dockers.